Welcome everyone to the fourth installment in our domain-driven design series with Michael Plöd. Michael currently works as a principal consultant for InnoQ in Germany. He is a domain-driven design practitioner since 2005, and today he'll be discussing domain events and the advantages of using in your software architectures. Michael, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you, Amy, for the nice introduction. And welcome back, everybody, on the fourth installment of this Pivotal Domain-Driven Design Webinar Series. Today, we are going to talk about I think, a very specific construct, the domain event, and how it can be used in various aspects in your applications. But we'll not just talk about software architecture, since domain-driven design is actually a lot about software architecture, but also a lot about communication and finding the right and the good and the decent design. So we will also talk about event storming, which is a way to moderate workshops, and it got invented by Alberto Brandolini from Italy. And we'll also take a brief look into that today. So this is nearly the last installment of the webinar series. I don't know if some of you were aware of it. We started off with an overview and the values of DDD, went into strategic design, talked about domains, subdomains, bounded contexts, and context maps. Last month, we talked about aggregates, entities, value objects. Today, we talk about domain events. And the last installment won't be in February. We pushed it to March in order to make room for the awesome Spring Boot 2 release, which is due in February, and there's going to be a webinar in February. So the next installment will be in March. March 29th will be the date, so mark your calendars. Few words about myself. My name is Michael. I come from Germany, currently sitting in Munich, and I'm a principal consultant at InnoQ, so I do a lot of consulting. I do a couple of DDD workshops, and I work with domain-driven design, various aspects from 2006 on. So I hope I got a few things to tell you. You can follow me on Twitter. My nickname is Bitboss, and I also have a GitHub account. And I'm currently writing a book, and I pushed it from last year, end of last year, to Q1. Things are looking good. And I will stick to that date this time around. So if you haven't checked this out, it's on LeanPub. The name is Domain-Driven Design by Example. Now, let's dive into a little bit on DDD. Basically, I am by far not an inventor of domain-driven design. I'm basically a huge fanboy with a loud mouth about domain-driven design. So I think there's a lot of truths and good ideas in the books by Eric Evans. That's the blue book on the left side, and by the books of Vaughan Vernon, especially the red book on the left side. And I think especially when we talk about microservices, there is a lot of interesting stuff in there. And especially when we talk about domain events, in my eyes, a very popular approach of tackling the communication between microservices or self-contained systems is actually event-based approach. And when we talk about event-based approaches, we obviously have to think how we structure our domain events or the events that we send along. Do we go for coarse-grained or fine-grained events? And yeah, this is what we are going to be talking today. Now, let's start off with a stakeholder in a project. Now, if we look at this guy on the left side, he's talking, let's say, in sentences. If a person has signed a contract, we need to send out a welcome package. We need to make sure that he gets access credentials, and he needs to get the voucher book from our partners, for instance. Or after the customer hasn't gone back to us on a contract offer for 2 weeks, we should send them a reminder letter and remind them of our offer and offer them further support. Or another way of going there is, hey, please notify me if we sold stock for over €1 million or something like that. Now that is one way of communicating. And then we have another guy with the no home like localhost shirt. After sending out insert statements to the orders table, we need to send a query with a sum statement and see if the stock trades were over €1 million. And we need to check the status flag of field whatever in system X, or after we've called system X over a web service SOAP endpoint, we need to take a look into the SOAP envelope in order to get some information from it, whatever information that may be. So you obviously see that those two guys are speaking quite a bit of a different language. So we might run into issues regarding the ubiquitous language. And this is a very common thing. It happens in a lot of projects, in a lot of organizations. And there are many ways to deal with that. If you've been a part of the first installment of the webinar series, we talk quite a bit about the ubiquitous language, and I mentioned it throughout all of the other parts of the webinar series, that DDD is really keen on being good and precise in terms of language usage in our project. Now, this is where domain events actually come into play. If we look at modern IT or at IT in general right now and programming, there are many ways of looking at events. Take a look at the browser JavaScript world. We have an on-mouse clicked event, an on-mouse hover event, an on-key down event, or whatever. Those are very, I would say, very technical, very fine-grained events, and those are actually not the events we want to talk about today. Today we want to talk about events that business experts or domain experts really care about. We want to talk about, I would say, a higher level kind of event here. So we want to talk about events that really happen in the business. For instance, a customer has signed a contract, or we've received a cancellation note. Somebody has unsubscribed from their whatever Spotify subscription or something like that. Those are actually events that we want to talk about today. And the nice thing is we can, on the one hand, model activity in a given business domain with those events. So basically, sort of activity, let's say in a sales funnel or in a process, can be modeled as a series of those discrete events. And the nice thing about it, those events are really easy to understand, and they have a very simple semantic, and they are a really simple thing to explain to non-technical stakeholders as well. And we can put them on a timeline, so we can see how the events propagate over a system, over a process, and it's a really useful tool. But there are, in terms of the semantics and the rules for events, there are a few things you should actually consider. The first thing is, an event is something that has happened in the past. It's not something that is happening right now or that will happen in an hour or 2 hours or something. So, for instance, I'm currently sitting on the, 13th floor of a big office building in Munich, and a snowstorm just passed, big snowstorm. So basically, I can say snowstorm has passed. So this is an event that has happened. I can't go back in time and say, I didn't like the snowstorm, I changed it to we had sunshine or something like that. So an event is always something that has happened. And if you work a lot and intensively with domain events, you will notice that they sort of automatically become a part of the ubiquitous language in your process. I've seen that at a couple of customers and a couple of organizations. As soon as you started to talk about events, with the names of events, with the semantic of the events, you really had a very good flow, especially with domain experts and business people, that they started catching up on the event names and started using them regularly. Now, let's take a look at a few examples here. So one example would be, for instance, a shipment delivered event, a customer verified event, a cart checked out event. Those are very good examples for events. And I think I don't have to explain the meaning of those events to anybody who's listening or who's viewing this webinar right now. So obviously a shipment has been delivered, a customer has clicked on a verification link, or somebody has checked out a shopping cart in an e-commerce location. Now, let me give you a couple of bad examples. Create customer event is not a really good name for event, because we're not creating the customer right now. An event is something that has happened in the past. The will save item event is a similar case. An event is not something, event does nothing. An event is just something that has happened. And then my favorite event is the do stuff event. With the do stuff event, you just need one event and you can model a whole system. Well, with the downside that the do stuff event really doesn't tell you what it actually does. And so to sum that up, the events in the upper part of the slide are good examples. The other ones are things you should obviously try to avoid in your applications. Now, when you look out for events, a common thing that many teams and organizations do is that they look for origins of events. And I would say the most common used and the most commonly found origin for events are actually user actions, where some person is clicking a button on a website or on their mobile phone, or when they submit something. And this is a very commonly found event. Now, another interesting thing is time. Time can also trigger events. Let's say you have an application that's, well, trying to sell retail loans, and you send out a contract proposal for a loan contract. And after 2 weeks, and this contract proposal has a grace period of 2 weeks, and after 2 weeks, the customer still didn't get back to you, and you still haven't received the letter with the signed contract. So that can raise an event, customer didn't get back to us event, just in a very simplistic manner. Now, this is a timing thing, or you send out an offer and after a month, the offer is invalid. So time can trigger events. Another often overseen trigger can be documents. So you send out the contract and the person signs the contract, your potential customer, and sends the contract in a written way via snail mail way back to you. So also this letter, this document can trigger events. Or you're signed up for some insurance and you say, "Ooh, another insurance is cheaper. I cancel my subscription with the insurance," and you write a letter, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, send it back to the insurance company. So this letter basically triggers an insurance canceled event or something like that. But also other applications can obviously trigger event. If something happens in an application, it can trigger an event. Or you can work with cascades of events. Now, let's say we go back to our retail credit example. There is a component, a bounded context called scoring that is obviously calculating a few figures on your loan proposal or your loan application, and then the scoring is negative. And there is a business rule that says a negative scoring should be lead to an automatic decline of the contract. So scoring negative event automatically triggers credit application declined event. So this is another way of looking at that. A very important thing is a domain event is always immutable. It does never change. Now, this is obviously true because we can't go back in time and change things. But I'm not going to talk about a lot about event sourcing today, where you could use domain events as your persistent model, where you just basically store away your events in a database or an NoSQL storage or something like that. But let me mention one thing here. In the event sourcing world, there is a lot of talking about never change events, and there is no deletion of events. This is obviously true with one exception, and the exception is regulatory requirements. Eventually, you're forced by data protection laws or something, especially in Germany or in many European countries, we have very strict data protection laws. You will be forced to delete certain data. And by delete, I do not mean let's send out a data deleted event. I mean a physical delete of the data. So there can be an exception to that in the case of event sourcing. But that's all I'm going to talk about event sourcing today. Now, going further, you can think about how do I scope my domain events? Should I scope them or derive them from entities, from value objects, or from aggregates? My recommendation is scope them on aggregates, because aggregates are a little more coarse-grained. There is more, I would say, business meaning, more business value to them. And you obviously can derive more meaningful events from those aggregates, because what you actually want to avoid is to solely rely on entity created, entity updated, entity deleted events, and you want to have a higher degree of business meaning to them. So in my eyes, scoping them on aggregates obviously leads you to this higher, I would say, business meaning here. And I made a few really good experiences in doing so. Now, one more thing in terms of an implementation. We talked about aggregates. Now, what you can actually do is you can combine your aggregates on an implementation side with the command pattern. And in the command pattern, you can basically, as most of you obviously know, you transform methods to objects, and you can scope commands on aggregates. And let's say you put some data into a command and you call the execute method, and a potential return value of the execute method of the command pattern could be a domain event or some domain events. I think this is actually a really good idea in doing, because the command basically represents the intention to do something. So ramping up a command is basically, hey, I want to do something. Calling execute means, yes, I'm doing something right now. And the result of the command is what has happened in the command. So again, we are in the past here, and the result can be a domain event in this case. So I've compiled a few examples for you folks. So a ship order command can return a order shipped event. An add comment command can return a comment added event. Or a decide on the credit application command can return a credit decision positive or a credit decision negative event. And a lock credit application command can return a credit application locked event. So as you can see, this fits perfectly together with a high, I would say, a good fit on the ubiquitous language being used. So there's a high degree of consistency here as well. Now, the next thing we want to do with our events is we want to use them for the communication between various bounded contexts. We can use them inside a bounded context, or we can even use them for the, let's say, communication between systems. And obviously, we need to think about the payload that we transport with those events. Actually, I talked quite a bit about this one with various colleagues of mine from InnoQ, with other folks from the community, and I came to the conclusion that the four major options for the event payload are a full payload, a REST URLs or RESTful URLs, then empty events, and a mix between full payload and REST URLs. Let me guide you a bit through those options. The first option here would be that you basically put a full object graph, for instance, of an aggregate or some other data structure into the event. The pro argument for that is that basically your consumers have all the data they need for processing your event. So this is a very easy thing to do, and your consumers will obviously love this approach. But there is a downside to that, and what I always say is that we obviously, in good, decent software design and software architecture, we want to reach something called high cohesion loose coupling. And in my eyes, there is a little bit too much talk on the consumer side of loose coupling and not enough talk about the provider side of loose coupling. Because I think loose coupling actually starts at the provider side. How much do I actually allow my consumers to couple against some internals that I have? Now, if you put all that data into your events, you obviously allow your consumers to a higher degree of coupling, because they have a lot of data at their hands, and usually data that is present will be used and will be consumed. Now, another way of dealing with that is that you don't put a lot of data, actually no data in it, especially except for some metadata, and that you just put a RESTful URL into your event. Now, a very important thing here is, I said, please derive your events from aggregates. I think that's a good idea. I totally stick to that. But the URL to the RESTful resource here is not the URL to your aggregate. So that's not your Spring Data REST or whatever URL here. This is a URL that should point to an event. Why do I stress that? I said events should be immutable. Now imagine the following case. You put the URL to an aggregate here, which is basically mapping to some data structure. And a consumer is consuming your event at, let's say, 4:30 p.m. Now, at 4:35, somebody does something with the aggregate which changes some attributes of the aggregate. Now, you're consuming the same event again at 4:44, for instance. You're breaking the immutability here because the data has changed. And it is very, very important that you point to the event here. And obviously, this scenario here is a really good fit. It works out well when you, I would say, when you go ahead and use event sourcing, because you obviously have the event stream already stored in some storage. Another way of dealing with those things are events that can say no data or just I would say a lookup key, let's say an application number, a customer number, or something like that. Let's say credit application declined for the application number 127, for instance. And this is eventually, I would say, a good idea for, I would say, simple notification events that are not being consumed heavily, just as a trigger for doing some stuff. Or if you really go for very empty events, that's a good idea when you don't have a lot of, let's say, updates to certain events. Then when those events, let's say, happen, let's say, 50 times a day, and you implement, let's say, the stream of data as an admin feed. I will talk about that in a few minutes because it's not just about message brokers here. There are other options as well. So basically, that might be a good idea as well. Approach that I see very commonly used is a mixture of using data and RESTful URLs in events. I think this is a good idea for adding commonly used data to the event. So that's data where you know, hey, this is being used heavily by nearly most of all of my consumers. As far as I know, they obviously need that data and they rely on it. You can put it in. But all the additional stuff can be put behind a RESTful URL to a RESTful resource. Because let's be honest, grabbing data out of an event is easy and very cheap. Calling a RESTful resource leads for the consumer to handle resilience, client-side load balancing, and so on and so forth. Yes, there are nice technologies in the Spring Cloud sector for it, like Spring Cloud Netflix stuff, but you need to do more things. And us as developers, we're obviously lazy and we want things the easy way. Now, I have implemented a small case study for those things. And I will talk about a little bit about this case study today. And I will do a very deep dive of the case study in the next installment on March. This park here, some of you already know it eventually, is basically a loan shark. And he has a credit application where he's selling heavily overpriced retail loans. And I implemented a small application consisting of, I think it's 4 systems that are, let's say, that are communicating with each other through domain events. And the flow is over a couple of UIs. I will show you a few screenshots in a second. But the nice thing is this demo leverages various ways of communicating with events. So we have basically all of the flavors in place that I just discussed with the payload. So you can take a look at how to handle those events. Now, the next thing that is in there, and this is something that I think is really important, and I will talk a lot about it in the next installment when we talk about implementation. When you want to implement event-driven microservices, you do not necessarily have to go for a message broker in order to distribute your events. Yes, message brokers like Rabbit or Kafka are really powerful tools. They can do a lot of things. They are really good at what they are doing. But you need to be aware they are just another piece of infrastructure that you obviously have in your applications. And you need to install it, you need to maintain it, you need to secure those things. And I think what those infrastructure components have in common, yes, they are very easy to set up right away, but they are really hard to tune, harden, maintain over the time. And there are use cases for them, but I think a lot of applications would be actually totally sufficient if they would use HTTP feeds for the event communication. Eventually, some of you folks remember the good old days of Google Reader, RSS, Atom feeds, and so on. And this is a technology you can actually leverage from your Spring application in order to have events, to publish events from microservices. This is very, very simple Spring REST and Spring Web business. And you can leverage all the good features from the HTTP world in this example. So you can work with last modified headers. You can cache those things. You can work with HTTP security. You can work with TLS, SSL, and so on and so forth. So basically, HTTP delivers you a lot of stuff. And this GitHub example, which is publicly available on GitHub, implements all those flavors. So you can check that out. We will talk about a lot about that in detail in the next installment when it's all about code. I don't want to go into code today, just a brief example over a couple of UIs. So you basically apply for, you say, hey, the term, I want a loan over 12 months for, let's say, 1,200 euros, and I need it for buying food for this hungry fat pup on the image up there. You enter your financial situation, how much you earn, how much you spend per month, and then you enter your personal details and you hand in the credit. And in terms of an event flow between the microservices in this example, it looks a little bit like that. There's an application process which handles the business process basically, and it fires off a credit application number generated. So we generate an application number for a new, let's say, for a new credit application. And this event is being consumed by two microservices, the credit decision and the credit application. In order to, for instance, in the credit decision, start setting up a decision memo in order to derive a proper decision if you want to do the credit or not. Now, the interesting thing on the credit application side is that it works with two domain events. One is called credit details entered, and the other one is called financial situation entered. Now, the interesting thing here is, do other microservices or do other bounded contexts really care if someone has entered a couple of credit details or their financial situation? I don't think that this is a good case, a good idea. To publish those events to the outside, because they are internal events that are only relevant for the credit application. Now, in this case, the credit application is actually using event sourcing to store those events to a database, and it's using an event sourcing for the poor with Spring, JPA, and stuff like that. Usually, you would do that with more sophisticated technologies like Spring Data Cassandra, or use Cassandra or something, some other good event store or the Axon event store. And that brings me actually currently to a question that has been raised from the audience. There was a question if I can recommend a DDD and the event sourcing frameworks that would fit in the Spring framework ecosystem. I would take a look at the Axon framework right now. I think they are quite ambitious. They started a company based in Amsterdam. Looks pretty decent to me. I've never worked with it in production, but I think they have a pretty holistic and good approach on that. Eventually, you want to take a look at that. Or Eventuate is also something I would take a look at, especially for this credit application context. That might be a pretty good choice as well. Now, the thing that is interesting in terms of the credit application is when we hand in the credit application. Usually, when you work with in a process like that, you usually go ahead and say, hey, yes, now I want to hand in my credit application to the bank. This is where other bounded contexts and or microservices start to get interested in. For instance, the scoring. We want to score things, and before we do that, or after entering the credit application, I forgot about that, sorry, we enter our customer data. So customer created is also something we care about. Now, scoring can consume those two events and perform a scoring on them. In the code, you will see that this is happening independently of each other. So it doesn't matter for scoring if the customer event arrives first or the credit application event arrives first. Scoring just scores whatever it gets, and when both parts are there, scoring is taking a decision. And it says, my scoring is positive or it is negative. Now, based on that, there's the credit decision that either says, yes, I approve that application, or I do not, I decline the application right away. So if you're interested in, check it out on GitHub, github.com/Plöd. It's a project that is pinned to my GitHub profile. Now, one of those, a very popular question that often comes along the way, yeah, that's a good idea, that's interesting, but how do I actually identify all those events? How do I make sure that I'm not missing out on something? And since domain-driven design is not just about technology, but also a lot about communication and how I interact with business people, there is a very popular thing right now in the DDD community, and it's called event storming. Event storming has been invented by Alberto Brandolini. Alberto is based in Italy, and it is actually no technical tool at all. It's a way of moderating workshops with various stakeholders, and this is something I'll show you in a minute, that event storming really propagates, that you have a very diverse set of people in a room that are grooming over potential events. Alberto wrote a small blog post about that a couple of years back. I put the link also in the attachment and link section. And it's an analysis method based on events. Alberto also wrote a very interesting book. He's also publishing himself on LeanPub. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend you to read that book as well. Now, what is event storming about? First of all, event storming is highly analog. So it's not about UML tools, not about doing some stuff in PowerPoint on a computer or with a old school requirements engineering tool. It's analog. Basically, all you need in terms of tools for event storming is a room with a wall, a long paper, for instance, from a plotter paper or something like that, a couple of pens, and many, many Post-its. So that's all you need for event storming. And basically, to start off with, the first recommendation I like to give is try to remove or put the tables and all the seats out of the room, or put them against one wall and have, let's say, a big moderation space where you put up a long piece of paper against the wall and you start marking a timeline. So time goes from left to right, so you just draw an arrow on it. I will show you a couple of photos in a few minutes, so you get a grab how it looks. And you invite the right people. Now, invite the right people is a rather general remark. Basically, the right people means domain experts, software architects, developers, people from the testing team. I think especially testers, quality people do bring a lot of interesting remarks to those let's say meetings, because they do have a totally different view on things like developers or domain experts. Invite, for instance, a project manager, and then you say, okay, we want to analyze, let's say, this retail credit process from the POC bank. And you start off with one event. Let's say you just write the event name on a post-it, preferably orange color. That's the usual color you use, but in the end it doesn't matter. And let's say credit application declined event. Boom, you put that against the wall. Then somebody comes along, yeah, but we need a negative scoring for the decline of the credit application. So scoring negative event, boom, the next event. But in the scoring, customer scored, financial situation scored. Let's say we have a credit agency, a rating agency in place as well. So rating scored and so on. And you start off putting a lot of post-its against the wall. And I would say I prefer doing, let's say, 2-hour event storming workshops. And I can highly recommend of hiring a good facilitator for your first steps. Eventually, you have some folks in your organization that have already done it, or you go ahead and hire a pro like Alberto, for instance, who has done that a lot and who has a lot of experience. I've done one event storming workshop with Alberto, and it was a really great experience. Can highly recommend that. And so, because when you facilitate such a workshop, you need to take a certain look at, I would say, dominant persons or people who have, let's say, a very strong opinion and who are highly regarded in this group. So you need to take a little bit of a look at group dynamics here in order not to screw some people or not to cut some more silent or more quiet persons off, because they also bring a lot of interesting things against the wall. And let me go to the next slide. You can use a lot of sticky notes. Ideas are use them for events, external systems, external organizations, artifacts such as aggregates, for instance. And I have a few pictures of event storming. That's from a training I did, and the next few pictures are actually from an event storming workshop that we have done at InnoQ with Alberto. So we said, hey, we want to exercise a bit of event storming, and this is basically the wall, how it looked after, I think, 3 hours of working on it. The task in this case was, hey, let's model the German railway system. So for those who are not from Germany, the rail is a very, very important means of transportation in Germany. So basically, when I do business trips in Germany, I rarely, or actually this year around, I plan to never fly. I do everything by train because they are fast and I think they are reliable. Some Germans will disagree with me, but it works really well. But it's an extremely complex system, and we started finding out, hey, what are usual events in this railway thing? And we went ahead, and you can see a couple of colors here. So the orange ones were events. The dark purple ones were things to notify. And then you see some events turn 40, some post-its turned 45 degrees. That's some open questions and so on. And yeah, it was a very interesting experience to do that, because you can't just use events for identifying domain, or event storming for identifying domain events. You can also use it for further explorations. The first thing that I realized from workshops that I've done is that you can harmonize towards a ubiquitous language very quickly, because usually after 15 minutes, you already have a couple of events that display the same thing, but written down with different words, different wordings, and so on. So you can say, hey, listen, there's a clash in the ubiquitous language. Let's harmonize that right away. And the next thing is you can identify aggregates very, very well, commands very well, and also identify bounded context, subdomains, and things like this. I would like to highly recommend you to check this out. There are, I think, a lot of DDD meetups and conferences right now. There are a lot of event storming workshops, and I made some really good experiences in doing that. So if you have a chance to do that, I highly recommend you to check this out. I really like this approach, because one thing I really like is time of really highly skilled domain experts is usually very rare. And I think the dynamic of a typical, let's say, meeting room sitting around a big table and having a PowerPoint discussion with a domain expert is a very slow process. I think you can squeeze out way more knowledge and information with these highly dynamic sorts of workshops here. So I have a very high recommendation for that as well. Now, content-wise, I would be done. So if you have some questions, you can fill them out in the forum. Currently, there's one question which I answered. I hope I answered it to you. And in the meantime, while you think about your questions or while you send your questions your way, let me mention again, on March 29th, we will put away all the theory. The first 4 parts were mainly theory-driven, and we talked a lot about patterns, ideas, structural things and stuff on PowerPoint, on the Black Talk slides. Part 5 will contain no slides from my side, except for the Hi, I'm Michael slide. And we will go directly into code, and we will implement 2 microservices or 3 microservices using a lot of Spring Boot, Spring Data, Spring Cloud technologies. And we will put that together into a consistent software architecture and have something up and running by the end of the webinar. It will leverage a lot of things from the example pet project that I just mentioned. So if you really want to get your hands dirty with all the Spring technologies in the context of domain-driven design, I can highly recommend you to join this webinar. Eventually, I will have a co-host as well on it. I'll need to figure that out, but it will take place March 29th. Now, again, I'm currently writing a book. If you're interested in trainings and consulting on DDD, go to InnoQ and check out our offerings. I offer, or we offer, DDD trainings, consulting, and stuff like that. So if you're interested, check it out. You can follow me on Twitter, and let me see if there's some questions coming in. No questions so far. Amy, do you have a couple of words to the audience?
Well, let's wait a few moments here and see if we have any questions coming in from the audience.
Yeah.
We have a poll running. We'd love to hear from folks what topics you'd like to see and hear us talk about for future webinars. And we'd also really very much appreciate feedback from you all regarding today's presentation and topic. That's very helpful as well for us in planning future sessions. There was one question, Michael. I don't know if you saw this question or if this is something that...
The technology? Event
can
sourcing
you recommend
framework?
a DDD and event sourcing framework that would fit into Spring Framework ecosystem?
Well, actually, I answered it, but briefly take a look at Eventuate or Action.
All right. Well, thank you, audience, for your votes and your feedback. Thank you, Michael, for today's session and everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you for our March session.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on. There's another question that's just come in. Michael.
Can you please explain how one goes from recording the domain events, identifying aggregates commands, to identifying domains and subdomains bounded context? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the way that your way usually is with events, you start on I think, or my experience, I don't think there is a general answer to that. My experience is that after such an event storming workshop or an idea of events, you have a very fine-grained view on your domain. So obviously, your next step are aggregates. And after that, you're often stuck in a thinking, should I go for coarse-grained bounded context, or should I go for rather fine-grained bounded context? Personally, my first step would be to prefer, especially when you want to derive microservices from bounded context, I would prefer rather coarse-grained bounded context, but I would stick on the implementation side very strictly to the rules of aggregates, because I'm not a very big fan of pre-major decomposition. So I would rather go for coarse-grained bounded context, and then you obviously see you have a couple of bounded contexts, and you see those events are passing between them, and I think you obviously have the bounded contexts that have a lot of eventful communication between the two obviously belong in a certain degree to subdomains, and after that you can go to domains. I'm not so much someone who is thinking extremely or putting much thought into the domains, because they are, I would say, from an implementation side, a little bit too coarse-grained. I think my approach is always get your bounded context with your aggregates right, get a good fit in terms of subdomains, and then go on a macro architecture level to rules between communication between the bounded context inside a subdomain, and then rules for the communication between subdomains. For instance, I prefer communicating between subdomains with feeds and not over a message broker. That's an example, for instance, here. That is actually my approach, and I hope that explained a bit to you. Then there was another question. Any preference between Action versus Eventuate? No. Please check out which one you prefer, which one fits your needs better. I haven't personally used those in production, and I'm not a very big fan of recommending stuff that I haven't used in production. Both look pretty decent to my eyes. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you again, Michael, for today's session, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be opening the Part 5 registration soon, and we hope to see you back for that on March 29th. Have a great day, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone. A great day from my side as well.